everyone, welcome. My name is Mike Zaremba, and I'm with my brother Andy, and we are launching our very first edition or episode of VancouverReal, if that even is the name we stick with it. And this is our first podcast, and we're gonna try to do this hopefully on a weekly basis. This first one isn't live streaming, but we are gonna edit it and put it out there as soon as we can, regardless. And this is the first go, so have a little patience with us. But I think we're just going to dive right into the conversation and not get into too much of it. Of course, we're being aired here out of Float House. Float House is a sensory deprivation tank center or flotation center in Vancouver, BC, where we have isolation tanks, which will be a huge part of our conversation today, most likely because we have one of the co-founders of one of the original float centers, or near the original float centers that started on the West Coast. We'll get into that, but yeah, that's my intro that was really off the top of my head. So this is VancouverReal, and we have Ahmed here helping us behind the scenes from Omega Point, and we'll get into that near the end, just wrapping up with what that all is about. So today we have with us Graham Talley from Float On in Portland, Oregon. He's one of the co-founders of Float On, which is the largest float center in the continental U.S. and I guess the non-continental U.S.
All of the U.S., yeah.
Yeah, what is it? Hawaii and Dominican and anyways.
Alaska,
Guam?
yeah.
Alaska, yeah.
Yeah.
And Guam.
Guam. Is that still?
Yeah, so like Alaska and Hawaii are usually just considered the non-continental U.S. The other ones are outlying territories, I think.
Yeah. See, we just in Canada we keep our country pretty much together. We don't play. Okay, we're going to take that strategic outpoint way off in the north coast called Alaska and say that's ours now. So, anyways, Graham is on tour. Actually, he's doing a book tour for the re-release of Dr. John C. Lilly's book, The Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer, which is coming out May 15th, and we'll let him talk more about that. And basically, welcome Graham to Float House, and welcome to VancouverReal. Thanks for being our first guest ever.
It's my pleasure. Yeah, I love to be a guinea pig, so
Perfect.
Happy to help you guys out. And I also like talking a lot, so if anything, you guys will probably have to shut me up a little bit on the podcast if you want to get a word in edgewise.
We'll try to get in there. So. And then obviously Andy is my brother here and my business partner. And,
Yeah, it's actually really fitting that Graham's here today from Float On, because Float On is definitely one of the biggest influences that we had when creating Float House. I mean, we literally looked at what you guys did and we're like, okay, let's do that. That is working down in Portland. So we just kind of looked at what you guys were doing and we're like, well, if it's working there, it can work here. And it was almost that simple when we first started off. And so it's great to have you here today with us.
Little did we know it's not simple.
Yeah, that's what we found out afterwards.
About floating, the whole concept. It sounds like the whole, initial proposal of it, the whole thought of it, idea is an amazing idea, and it's just like, yeah, float center is the best ever, and it is. It's amazing. Don't get me wrong, I love it. But it's once you start digging into that bag of dirt and pulling out all the worms, it's an interesting beast all on its own, And then you guys have been in it for how long now?
So a little over 3.5 years is how long we've been open now, which, in the general spectrum doesn't seem too long, but the industry in general has just been growing so fast right now, pretty much exponentially, which strangely we find ourselves now one of the older centers, even though we're only 3.5 now, yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, Graham and Ashcon and Quinn and Christopher and Jake, are those the 5?
Yep, and then Ian is the 6th behind the scenes, yeah.
And you guys have, so many projects on the go, obviously. You guys are always doing something new and different and very creative, which is huge to have at, just that amount of minds working together in a very creative way for this industry. So I think just what you guys are putting out there alone has been a tremendous service to it, in a lot of different ways. So I think all the ones that are, opening up now, all the different float centers that are on their way, it's, you guys had a big thing to do with that, and it's really been incredible to watch from the early days when I was watching it, and to grow into now, and it's, yeah. Congratulations on that success.
Was that your intention when you first started Float On, or was it just to open a float center and then you kind of got into the business development side of it after, or did it just kind of evolve into that?
Yeah, exactly. You know, so I mean, first of all, thank you for the congratulations, and thanks for having me out. And you know, congratulations to you guys too. Biggest float center in Canada, by the way, which I guess makes us the 2 largest float centers in the North America.
Yeah,
sure.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and these guys have way more tanks than we do now. So
Yeah, we have 9 here and then 5. We just opened in Kitsilano with 5 tanks yesterday. So there we go.
Yeah, so you know, initially getting into it, we did really want to just open up a float tank center and see if that was viable, and kind of just like I'm sure any business opening up likes to think, we hoped that we would do well, that we'd open up more centers, maybe franchise down the road, etc. And yeah, I mean, also like the Zarimbas just hinted at, it was so much more work than I ever thought that it would be. You know, we thought that we'd construct some walls that were a little bit soundproof and slap some float tanks in there and run a business. And you know, what you realize when you're running float tanks is that you're pretty much running inside-out boats. And if there's one thing I know about boats, it's that they need constant maintenance and upkeep. And that is true of a float tank center too. You know, we just finished about $100,000 upgrade to our center that needed to be done because of the massive amounts of salt and water damage that had been coming through. And there are so many things that we just went in completely blind with, and yeah, ended up taking the worst for it after a certain amount of time. And I think, if anything, that was our motivation in starting to do consulting and help out other float tank centers was, you know, initially, like I said, yeah, we were just going to slap down a series of centers and just grow from there. And once we did one, we were just like, this is so difficult. I'm sure that anyone else who wants to open up is going to hit this problem. Like, how can we help them and make it easier for the person who comes after us? And this is also because our goal very much, you know, aside from just running a successful business, is just to spread floating. And, you know, our kind of stated mission objective is to get as many people floating as often as they want to, regardless of how much money they have in their bank. And, you know, eventually we realized that one of the best ways to do that is not through trying to selfishly keep our trade secrets or open up our centers that are exactly our way, but to share it with as many people as possible so that more and more centers can open up, and regardless of if we're the ones running them, that more and more people can actually get floating and hopefully improve their lives a little bit.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, that's one of the things about it too, is when you get into it, there's a lot of challenges and a lot of different ways of a business, because it is such as infancy, still relative infancy of this newer industry coming up. You know, not only you have manufacturing, you know, challenges, and then you have marketing challenges, and you have customer service challenges, because you're trying to introduce something brand new to people that they've never seen before or heard of before, and like, why would I even want to do this? So you have all these like pretty substantial challenges in a lot of major areas of any business, you know, whereas you know, another business, perhaps you might, you know, have one of those things, but this, since it is in this newer epsilon of what it is, there's so many huge challenges in all these multifaceted areas. So, you know, and it's impossible to predict, you know, and for you guys, and I think for anyone getting into the game, it's very like, wow, okay, there's a lot of things to address, and that's why you guys started Float Tank Solutions, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I was just curious, like you said, it's really hard to describe these things. It actually got me thinking, I was wondering what your actual pitch is now that you've been open for a while, too. If someone's like, walks in, they haven't heard about floating, how do you break it down for them?
It's just the normal explaining what a float tank is and what floating is. And
so pretend like I'm new, like I'm just asking you, like, what is floating? How would you describe it?
I would basically say you step into a tank, and I would go on saying that it's light-proof, soundproof, 10 inches of water, super saturated with 900 pounds of Epsom salts. And the whole idea is to minimize sensory input coming into your body. And I'll kind of wrap it up by just saying, like, you know, this induces really deep states of meditation, relaxation, and I'll get into some of the physiological benefits. But I keep it pretty generic at first, and I'll see if they're kind of interested. And if they want to know more, then I'll kind of elaborate on that. But yeah, I just tell them what it is and why you would actually use it.
Definitely.
And then first thing they say is, I think I'd be claustrophobic, you know? And then, who was it? I think it might have been you, but once you get in, it's from like your frequently asked questions, which, have you guys have never changed that really in a long time?
No,
right?
it's pretty much stayed the same.
And I'm assuming, did you write those ones out yourself?
Yeah.
Because it sounds like when you read it, it's like, yeah, that's Graham talking pretty much. And I use this one a lot is, well, when you're inside, you actually have no perception of boundaries. You know, you don't see the sides, you don't see the top, you don't feel the bottom because you're floating in the solution. And so when you're nicely centered in the tank, you don't feel the sides, you don't see them. So it actually feels much more expansive than constricting. And I think that's what is written in your frequently asked questions on your website. And I'm like, yeah, that's a great way of articulating it because it totally does. And it's once you get over that little mental hurdle, you know, then you realize everything's completely safe. Then, you know, that's when you can really let go and relax and have your own experience, you know. So have you guys evolved your elevator pitch?
Yeah, you know, it's so the reason, I was asking you guys, I mean, first of all, I was just curious. That's one of the things that I love getting from different float centers that I visit is just how they even describe floating.
Yeah.
You know, we've been refining ours since we've been open. So I guess like 3.5 years going into my own personal elevator pitch for floating. And like you guys said, it's such a unique challenge to try and explain something that people haven't done before. So mine, when someone says, hey, what is this float tank thing, sensory deprivation? I usually describe it like a perfect bathtub. So I say, well, a float tank is pretty much like a perfect bathtub. It's 4 feet wide, it's about 8 feet long, there's about 11 inches of water in there, and you get inside and you float in there. There's 850 pounds of Epsom salt in the water, and so you're really buoyant. You float just on the surface. Your ears are below the water. You're about cut in half by the water line, and that alone is awesome for your back. So immediately, just upon the zero gravity, I start going into benefits before I talk about it being closed in or dark or anything more threatening.
Right.
So I say that alone, just the Epsom salt, your spine decompresses, your muscles relax. It's kind of like getting a massage without getting touched. And that one came in because there are a shocking amount of people who like the idea of massage but don't like being touched by strangers, which I hadn't realized. But we have a fair amount of customers who come in and say, I would so much rather come in to float with you than get touched by a massage therapist. Oh, wow. So I added in that specific line because of that group. So it's kind of like getting a massage without getting touched.
And you come from a psychology background. Like, what does it mean when I like being touched by strangers too? No, I'm joking.
You know, so tell me a little bit about your childhood.
Well, I wasn't touched at all. And so I basically go and, like, if a human won't touch me, I find an inanimate object and pretend it's a human and let it touch me.
So after that, so then you go into the other stuff, you know. So it's you have that very little gravity on your body, and then I talk about it being at skin temperature. So you just lose track of where your body ends and where the water begins. And when the room's really soundproof, and when you turn off the light, I always say that when you turn off the light, which implies that the light is under your control and on when you start out.
Yeah.
When you turn off the light, it's totally dark on the inside. So there's no sound, no sight, no sense of touch, and no gravity on your body, and you just float there, and the benefits are amazing. Your brain downshifts, your dopamine production kicks up, your cortisol, or stress hormone, drops down to almost nothing, and it's pretty much this condensed vacation for your brain and your body.
That's a great pitch.
Yeah, it's true.
I know, it makes me want to hop in a float tank just saying
we can just practice it a few times.
Yeah, no, it's true. And that's a cool thing too, is, like, you know, you kind of, it's interesting because you can start to gauge the reaction a lot of the time, and you can start kind of, I don't want to say like tailoring it towards them, but you kind of can.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
You can
just
see, like,
switch the entire thing depending on what they're interested in.
If they're more of, like, into the physical benefits, or more into the psychological benefits, or more into the more potential spiritual connotations that people label it with, you know, all those things. So, you know, and that's the cool thing is it's really just about the individual. You know, it's about the person that's going inside, and that's one thing I say quite a bit is, you know, the tank is just a tool, and the real variable in there is you. You know, and your biochemistry will change each day, your psychology will change each day. Everything, like your social relationships, will affect how your float is. So all these things will impact your experience before you go in. So it's important to just be aware of that. And you know, I often say too, like, I never have two floats the same. Like, they're always, I mean, you start creating similar patterns and things you like to kind of explore yourself with, or go into, or how do you relax in there, or whatever you're doing. But it's still never the same. Like, especially when you start to just let go, that's where things get interesting, because really surprising things kind of come up, you know, and that's where it gets fun. Like, you never know what could come out of a float. And it's, you know, and for 3 years now, we've been floating, and I'm as long as I have access to a tank, I will always float, and that's why I think a lot of us kind of get into this business and just promoting it in general is because we know that we're not going to be the only ones that find this so amazing and so therapeutic and so beneficial in our lives. And so just the fact that so many people don't know what it is and don't understand it and don't have accessibility to it, then those are the reasons we kind of get involved, or at least that's from our standpoint too. So. Yeah.
One thing about it for me is I really like being involved in a business that's actually really good for people as well. So, and it can actually really change people. When people walk through the doors and there's the stress and they're a mess when they come in, and then you see the change in them when they come out of the tank and how much more relaxed and calm they are. It's rewarding just to know that you're in a business that's actually benefiting people as opposed to creating any kind of harm, essentially.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure, yeah. I mean, I can't imagine getting the end of some of my 18, 20-hour days working on this thing, which goes back to that idea that building a float tank center is a lot of work, if you're thinking about it, just so you know. It's ridiculous. But, I don't understand how people who are running a restaurant business, which is, just as stressful, and arguably maybe even more so, their end product is food that they serve other people and I guess themselves, and our end product is relaxation. Like at the end of my 18-hour days, I hop in a float tank for 3 hours and I feel... a lot better by the end of it, yeah.
No, it's true. And actually, let's get into it a little bit before we start. I'm sure we could talk about floating and the whole get up and go. So, but just before we get too far off tangent, what are you doing up here, Graham? Why'd you come to Vancouver, and what's been going on these days?
Yeah,
with
so
you
that's
guys?
a good question. So we're up here. We just did a book reading over here at Float House earlier today. And that was for a book by the inventor of the float tanks, by John Lilly. And the book is called Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer, which has actually been out of print for about 25 years. There's a current edition in print, but you can look it up on Amazon. It's Programming in the Human Biocomputer. It's basically an abridged version. And the full text hasn't been available for quite a while. If you want to get it, you have to pay somewhere between $60 and $100 online to order a copy. And we ended up in contact with John Lilly's estate. And if any of you guys out there are unfamiliar with John Lilly, definitely just do a quick little Wikipedia search or look him up. Really amazing, just out of this world scientist, neurologist and biologist, psychotherapist, inventor of the float tanks, invented 3D brain image scanning technology. Did some first of tests with pushing the human body to limits like pressurization chambers and nitrogen absorption. Also experimented around with a fair amount of LSD and later on ketamine. If you've heard of dolphins being intelligent, John Lilly is the one who's responsible for pioneering the entire field of dolphin research and communication. Really just truly a giant of a human being. And the book is about something equally as pleasant, which is just this idea that we are a collection of programs and of our experiences and things that have molded us throughout our lives. And rather than being set in that and really solid entities, that we have control over who we become, that we can both feel our emotions and change those, and for the positive, hopefully, and that we can look at our personality and say, this is a part of me that I don't want, and shed it, and see other parts that we like and enhance them, and actually, rather than being simply a product of our environment and of chance and of our genes, really consciously mold and decide who we want to be and pursue that. And so it's my great pleasure to be doing this book tour and actually spreading John Lilly's name a little bit more.
Right, and you're saying like the goal on May 15th is to get individual. How does it work for Amazon?
Yeah, so one of the goals of doing this book tour and just releasing the book in general, of course, is to get John Lilly out there in front of as many people as we possibly can. I really do think it's a shame that he hasn't gained more awareness over time, and that instead he's been declining in awareness. And one of our goals is to get him to the top of the Amazon bestseller list. Cool. So ideally, to do that, we're trying to sell 1,000 copies on the launch day, which is just, 5 days from now?
Yeah.
On May 15th, which is a Thursday coming up. 4 days?
4 days, yeah.
So to do that, of course, Amazon doesn't want you logging on and buying 1,000 copies yourself. So you actually, there's not really gaming the system. You really do actually just have to sell that many copies on a day. And so any of you out there watching this, if you feel like logging on and checking out John Lilly, Programming and Metaprogramming in the Human Biocomputer on May 15th, hop on. We're having a sale that day. That'll be $13 day up to order the book.
That's a great deal.
And after that, it'll be going up to $19.95, which is
still a
obviously
good
still,
deal.
a quarter of the price that you can get it online used right now. And with luck, that 1,000 copies will actually push John Lilly to be an Amazon bestseller. If not in a category, maybe even overall, which would be great.
You were saying during your talk today about like how you guys got all these different versions of it and then started reading it and then combining them to get the most fullest sense. What was that whole, like how many versions did you get? What was that whole process kind of like?
Yeah, so we, given that we wanted to do this faithful reproduction and that one of our problems with the current version is that it's not a complete version, we wanted to make sure to get it right. So we started going back and, hopping on eBay and ordering copies of like the 2000 printing that he did for, the first edition, but the second printing of it, we couldn't find a first edition, first printing. There's only 1,000 of those out there in the world somewhere. We kind of bought every subsequent edition that had ever been published and started digging back through it, period by period, comma by comma. There's some things in there still that I have no idea where they came from. Maybe the first edition would help. There's little asterisks that lead nowhere, which we just kept faithfully in the text. We're like, okay, well, we can figure it out too. Like, I have no idea. Figure 1 in the book is just unlabeled kind of in the center of the book, as opposed to with all the other figures. And Ashkan really hates that. He's like, put it with the other figures. And I'm like, no, this is how it was in the book. I'm keeping it there. It's been a fun and interesting process kind of making those decisions along the way too. It's also just a really nice chance to go back through the book. Having read it a couple times already, actually spending that much attention, really going through sentence by sentence has been an incredibly enlightening experience. And I feel, even closer to John Lilly than I did before.
Sure. No, that's a massive, basically that's an editing, that's like the whole, relative you guys took on like, okay, we're going to become editors right now and kind of recreate, reformat, I guess, all these works by him. And you guys never had any background in that before, I'd assume, right?
Not officially.
Right.
I've done some theater work and writing and have done editing, but never professionally at all. This is by far the largest scope project like that I've taken on.
One thing I want to get into, this is a little tangent with John Lilly, is some of his dolphin experiments. Because you were telling me about the one. Did you ever read about the one where he had a dolphin in an apartment with a lady?
The dolphin house for sure.
Basically, he had a woman. I guess his whole idea was that he could actually teach dolphins language, and he thought that how babies actually develop language is spending time with their mothers and listening to their mothers talk and being around them. So his whole theory was if he put a dolphin in an environment with a woman, that she spent enough time with it that it would actually be able to learn language. And it was kind of interesting because the dolphin actually started getting kind of aggressive towards her at different points. And actually, at first, the dolphin was actually starting to make advances.
Let's make this clear. So basically, it's an apartment flooded with how much? Probably 4-6 feet of water, maybe?
Something like that. Enough so the dolphin could swim around in it. And
just going into you're like saying he invented all these. Like, this guy was like, he was not your typical.
Scientist.
Hi, I'm Bob from down the street. This guy was like, he's a whole different breed, really, so.
Yeah, for sure. So that's an interesting one, the dolphin. And the dolphin part of his experimentation, I'm less familiar with even than some people at Float On who have worked more, are more familiar with his dolphin literature.
Yeah.
We have an employee, Janine Bocci, who's actually very familiar with it, who would make another interesting interview for your podcast.
Cool. Sure.
But my understanding with that experiment, so they set up an actual house where it was on the ocean, and so the dolphin could go out to the ocean, but also come in. And the dining room was flooded with water. So if you're a human being, you're walking about knee deep in water, and if you're a dolphin, you can actually get up there and still hang out and be submerged in water and kind of move around the house a little bit. And so the idea was, he has this idea of coalition and interlock. He uses that with human beings as well. He wrote a book called The Dyadic Cyclone. He's really into dyads and this idea of finding that other in your life where you can kind of spiral around each other and progress forward. And the idea of interlock is basically why he said that people had not done any intelligent dolphin research before, is they're unwilling to take the time to develop that interlock, and that interlock with another human being, that interlock with another species of equal or even greater intelligence requires a good amount of time getting familiar. And so he said about 1,000 hours is how much time you need to actually get before you develop that relationship with a dolphin or with anyone, just like, with you guys. If we spent 1,000 hours together, I'm sure that our relationship would be a lot closer than it is now. And so that was the start of it. And so the best way to get towards that is actually, spending 8 hours, 10 hours, sometimes even up to 16 hours a day with these dolphins. And over a couple months, then you really got to actually be able to run experiments and do it in a way that you didn't feel like you were harming them or that they were purposefully trying to not go along with you. Because again, dolphins are pretty bright creatures. And to get them to even want to try and communicate with you is itself a great challenge.
Yeah. For sure.
And so that's the root of a lot of it. And he did all kinds of crazy things. And I think a lot of them can be traced back to the fact that after spending that much time with dolphins and having done his research on the size of their cerebral cortex, on the fact that they actually can speak kind of human speech, but they have to slow down their rate of speech tremendously in order to do it, because they speak at least an order of magnitude faster than we do. I want to say about 20 times faster is how fast they communicate
in terms of like the noises they make?
And the density of information that they're spreading.
Wow.
And when you think about that, so this is one I didn't tell during the talk, so I'll just tell it to you guys now. So when you think about that, that dolphins can communicate 10 to 20 times faster than human beings can, and might even be more than that. I just have to look it up again. They have huge ranges of things. We didn't even know the full spectrum of the size of frequency that they could communicate in for a long time, because it's so broad. It's crazy. And when you're in a water environment, that noise spreads a great distance. And so
that's cool.
It's worth noting that John Lilly later in his life thought that his early experiments on dolphins, not the dolphin house, but actually dissecting dolphins, taking them out of the ocean, this is back when people thought they were just big fish. He views that as akin to murder, and thought that was one of the huge regrets in his life. And so and it comes from this, which is, so knowing that is true, and knowing how far that information can travel underwater, why would they need a written language?
Right. Yeah,
you can spread information that quickly and that far. Yeah. It's an oral tradition.
Sure. And their level of communication is so broad then too, because the water's literally like transmuting it over great distance. So it's like, you could probably imagine having a conversation with, I'm here, but you're on like around the block, and I'm
and we're talking about whale song. We're talking about like hundreds of miles.
That's kind of cool. It's like they almost had like an internet for themselves in the water.
If John Lilly were writing this when the internet was around, that's probably what he would have said. And so he thinks that if we ever had any chance of figuring out what happened on our planet in the early years of tens of thousands of years ago, before we had written language, that it lies in the cetaceans, in dolphins, in whales, in the mammals who have been keeping a verbal tradition for so long. And he thinks that it's one of the great tragedies of our time, that we are polluting the waters with so much noise, that we're preventing that whale song from being transferred, that we're killing these, in his mind, like people, pretty much. We're killing these organisms that are likely more intelligent than we are. And, maybe not in the same way. They don't have physical, inventions and things like that, but you don't need that to be intelligent. His dolphin research is really amazing, but he says basically by doing that and by polluting these waters, we are eliminating any chance that we ever have of knowing the history of ourselves and of our species and how it came about and of our world at large.
That's crazy. Yeah, that's amazing. I've never even thought of it that way. Because you assume they have some sort of language that they speak and they communicate, and we know oral traditions is something that is very common with other human cultures across time and civilizations and stuff like that. And why wouldn't that be the case for other mammalian species and dolphins, things like that? And we know how they're hyper intelligent. What I mean?
And they definitely are not just squeaking or making vocalizations. They are definitely actually talking and communicating in a very real way.
They must be really frustrated with us right now.
I would say so. It's honestly that's some of the most depressing stuff out of John Lilly's writing is that, and he was doing this research back in the 50s, back in the 60s, back in the 70s, and we've known this for decades and decades, and it's still just doing nothing pretty much but getting worse. After reading John Lilly, it's hard to come away from that not feeling this great sense of tragedy that people aren't more well informed about that specifically.
That's fascinating though, for sure. I don't know, and that's cool. It's cool that the whole purpose of the tour is to kind of bring just his the work he's done, and it's great for helping to spread awareness of floating and float centers and stuff like that. But on a bigger scale of that is the work that he's done as a scientist and as a human being. It's because It's just one of those lives that are super unique. Like those types of the diversity that he tried to explore and explain, and from a very like scientific, objective angle, it seems like. Seems really, it's fascinating. It's commendable. It's super
great,
impressive.
And the fact that the person who, developed dolphin intelligence or, discovered dolphin intelligence and communication is also the one who invented float tanks and sensory deprivation, also the one who's playing around with early, post-EEG actual 3D brain scanning techniques. Yeah. There's probably a dozen other actual inventions that John Lilly created himself that we still use today, and whole fields that he developed that didn't exist before he came along that are now realms of science.
I wonder if there's any, like, I guess he never kept any type of, like, it would be really cool. I'd love to hear whether it's, or read even, if he had, like, log entries or just personal journals from his early times in the tank, from the times that he spent.
He does, if you read Deep Self, too.
Yeah.
It has at the end of that, like, a bunch of, his and other people's accounts of their time in his early float tank experiments and what they wrote down and their experiences with it.
That's cool.
So another great book. That one's actually out unabridged in... I might actually cut out one chapter in there randomly, but mostly unabridged or totally by Gateways Books, I believe, is the one that's doing that one.
Yeah, so that's who we order our books from.
Yeah, definitely worth checking out if you haven't read that one too. Deep Self is much more centered around float tanks. Programming and metaprogramming is much more. It's about consciousness exploration, but much more than that about LSD. And his experimentations around with that too is kind of the heavy emphasis of that one.
Right. And I think you should probably give people the precursor warning of, I guess he says it in the book as well, the whole, in his introduction or his foreword about get through the first bit because things kind of pick up later on, right?
Yeah. So basically he was, like so much with John Lilly too. And, we can go back to float tanks if we're going off on too much of a John Lilly tangent now, but...
there is no tangent. Yeah. There's no road or whatever.
The road and tangent thing just totally threw me off. What was the question?
You're talking about John Lilly, his books.
Yeah.
Consciousness isolation.
LSD. That's right. So he was. So he got his programming and metaprogramming was written about this 5 years of time that he spent at the National Institute of Mental Health, largely.
Right.
Which was on a giant government grant. And when he was playing around with LSD, it was government-sponsored, it was legal, he was writing them up under government auspices, and he was at that time doing his postdoctoral research because he was already a PhD. He had already been a professor. He'd already long gone through Caltech, which is the first school that he went to, and he was experimenting around with brain probes. He was experimenting around with LSD, with developing float tanks, and in programming, metaprogramming specifically, I think he finds LSD to be one of those tools that really lets us discover that what we view of the world is not actually the case. And for him, I think that he got really fascinated with it as a means to very clearly show your own brain that it is not actually in charge of things. That everything you see is a perception. And even just realizing that allows you to as he would say, deprogram and then reprogram so many other aspects of your life, realizing that essentially it is all collective illusion that we've created around us.
Yeah, it's that holographic universe concept, right?
Yeah, definitely tied into it, yeah.
No, I actually just started reading that book now, and like that's something that, I don't know, maybe it's just the stress from opening up another float center getting on me, and the lack of sleep and not being able to float myself or exercise and all the normal routines that make me feel normal. But the whole thing, it gets more like, it's like a rabbit hole, and you keep falling down it. You're like, the more you kind of experience, this is my experience, the more I experience, the more bizarre things get, the more interlaced almost they become, and it's just, I don't know, it just doesn't make any sense to me. But and that's why it's so fascinating to hear guys like Lilly he creates these, like, I remember when I read Center of the Cyclone for the first time, it was very hard to read. It was very, like, not because it was like it was just literally physically hard to read, because it's the jargon he uses and the nomenclature he uses to start describing all the different realms that he has going. It gets very technical, and like you were saying too, like you kind of got to get used to his style of talk and things like that, right? So, I think getting through that first chunk, because he deliberately wrote it, you said, to deter the average reader.
So John Lilly's super, like, dense and hard to get through anyway. Like in addition to being a highly trained specialist in several different high-level scientific fields, he also habitually was disappointed at the definitions and the word choice in the lexicon that even those advanced fields chose to use. And as a result, he oftentimes in his books ends up defining his own words, developing his own ways of talking about things, and even his own structures of how our bodies and minds are related and work together. Which, yeah, again, like being an already dense writer, having to then decipher his things and pretty much, turn them into, like have your brain translate those into a way that makes sense is definitely a challenge. Actually, a long time ago when I first read Center of the Cyclone, I got maybe a chapter into it and I was like, all right, are we allowed to cuss on this, by the way? Are you censoring
Yes.
this? Okay, yeah. I was just like, all right, fuck it. And I called up my friend, and I ended up dropping some acid that night.
Oh, wow.
And just reading through the entire rest of the book. And so my first experience was, reading through it in a similar state that John Lilly is talking about the entire thing.
Did it make complete sense then?
Honestly, not that I'm recommending that, but like I really connected with it. Like that might be the moment that I actually like fell in love with John Lilly and was just like, all right, this guy has it down. Like he knows what he's talking about.
That's so interesting. You were aware of Lilly and his works before you got into the whole float scene then?
I was.
Oh, interesting. Oh, cool. Yeah. I mean, obviously, I think for the majority of people, well, I don't know. It's weird because Lilly had this whole kind of following, right? He had this whole like little.
Yeah. So it would be rare that someone born, let's say, like before me, or even like my era. So I was born in '84. That we would be exposed to John Lilly. You have to be kind of like a special person or into that kind of fringe science to know that he exists. And for people born, like 50s or pre-50s, probably a lot more likely that they're aware of on some level of John Lilly, especially if they've all gotten into like the meditative consciousness or part of the 60s,
or even just,
like
seeing
seeing
science literature in general, because he was doing a lot of just other. Real science experiments back in the day.
But yeah, for a modern audience, very, very few people are now aware that John Lilly even existed, Yeah,
no, it's true. And then, I never personally ever listened to that whole, like, I know there's a pretty famous YouTube interview on, it's not YouTube, but it's on YouTube, the interview of him with that, he's wearing the fur hat, the hat with the raccoon tail, I think. And I mean, that's, other than that, I mean, you don't see or hear too much of them, unless you start really digging into it. You know?
Timothy Leary, Terence McKenna, Alan Watts, all those guys get a lot more play than John Lilly does, for sure. And it's funny because all of those guys considered John Lilly to be the scientist among them. You know what I mean? He was the rigorous one. Like they were all doing experimentation, but if anyone was bringing the science to the table, it was John Lilly. Yeah. And it's funny that he's the one now who we know less about. Maybe it is because he was so scientifically based and so rigorous with his stuff that it is a little bit harder to get through his work and doesn't spread as easily as McKenna or Leary or those other guys.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So you have this tour. It's launching May 15th. That's the big day of the sale, right?
Yeah, exactly. Help us buy the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think doing more things like this is just going to help floating in general, right? And we kind of talked about this earlier at lunch, that anything that, and this is one thing I've always really admired about you guys at Float On, is the way you've been able to do things hyper efficiently as well. Well, I mean, I'm sure you could have your anecdotal rebuttals to that, but from our perspective, like you see these really creative ways of spreading word of mouth, like the art book or the float conference in general. The fact that you guys were like, okay, let's do the float conference. We've only been open for a couple of years ourselves, but and this industry is on like a very infancy level. But we have this now is the third year running this coming August, right? What's the date on the float conference this year?
Yes, it's going to be August 9th and 10th for the float conference over in Portland, Oregon. Yeah,
and then the workshop again before that,
on
right?
the 8th. For people thinking about starting up a center. Yeah, we do like a one-day workshop there.
Exactly. So I mean, anyone that's thinking about getting into the float industry in any way, shape, or form, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's just buying your own float tank, or if you're just a floater yourself, or you're getting into the float center, the float conference now is third year in a row. And I mean, I've been to both of them, and from the first year to the first year was great too. I loved it. It was fantastic. And then the second year, you guys just took it to another level. And I imagine this year, you guys will just it's just getting smoother and smoother, and the content's getting more rich each time. And it's just great to have something growing in that nature for this stage of the game for the industry. You know, it's really
Is it
cool.
growing year over year?
Oh yeah. So I mean, it's only been 2 years we've actually put it on, so it
Right.
definitely grew from the first to the second. So it went from about 160 people up to around 230 people.
Nice.
And what's
Huge.
this year looking at?
So we're expecting somewhere between 300 and 350 coming out this year.
Nice.
Yeah. It's always really hard to tell because with
Sure.
conferences, people don't buy the tickets until like the least a month beforehand, pretty much. So we're just kind of basing it off of where things are at and where they were at last year. But
Well, we always, now that we're elbow deep into the float game now. As soon as you guys have those pre-sale cheaper tickets, we're like, okay, well, we gotta get 4, so let's get them. We got ours coming.
That's great. It really is magical too. Like the float conference is probably one of my favorite part of the year, honestly.
Cool.
Like when you get a room full of people, like 300 people who have decided with their lives they're going to open float tank centers and spend it doing floating. Like it is just some of the chillest, most interesting, most
Sure.
diverse background. Like I love the conference.
Oh, you start trading stories about, we had this one instance with hair, and we had this come
There's
up.
some things in a float tank center you just cannot talk to normal people about.
Exactly.
Had my third set of boots ruined by salt today, and people are like, oh yeah, that's.
When you have like that salt encrusted second skin over you, and you just like you feel like you're a stone statue basically from your maintenance days or whatever, because you do just get pretty much covered head to toe in salt.
Oh my god, yeah, you feel like a salt monster.
Oh yeah, no, the salt is a whole other beast.
Ashton had some great stories in his presentation last year.
Yeah,
Just the different stories about people walking out of the room at the same time, and three of them were fully dressed, and then one guy was just wearing his robe or just a towel or something, and the guy just turns around, walks back in the room. Or the squeegee that was just covered in Vaseline for some reason. Like just bizarre things that you find that happen in a float room.
Oh my goodness.
and that's what we know about. What's happening behind the closed doors of the float room? You know, who knows? I don't think we want to know necessarily all the time.
I mean, much more interesting is like what's happening in people's heads. I think in there,
Sure,
you know, like
definitely.
I mean, the funny stories and things like someone, going into float and we go in there and there's a walking cane that they've left behind
Yep.
and they never came back to get again. It's like, and those are amazing. But I think much more than that is just that when we leave our bodies alone in that solution, and as you guys know, it's just like you said at the beginning, the tank itself isn't anything. What's amazing is that it's eliminating everything else, and the human body, when left alone, when it's not being bothered by all of this stuff, does amazing things. It's about, twice as efficient at most tasks that it's doing when you're not distracted by stuff. And I'm more struck by how much this world keeps us down. Like how much we're fighting against our own potential all the time just to survive. And when you take that away, humans are way more amazing than we give ourselves credit for. And that to me is the real magic that's going on in these rooms for sure.
Yeah. What's the main reason that you float personally?
So it's really fun. I'm like a bad case study for floating myself.
Yeah.
Like Ashkan and I, like people come in and they meet Ashkan and I. Ashkan's one of my business partners. He's kind of like a Persian version of me. So he has a mustache, but he's Persian instead of Irish. So his mustache is like this big.
Yeah, his mustache is next level. If you haven't seen Ashkan, just go online and find Ashkan's picture.
Ashkan Jerome.
Impressive.
What's the question again? I got distracted by mustaches now.
So
what do you
personal reasons?
Yeah.
Personal reasons for
Yeah.
floating. Yeah. So Ashkan and I always say, people come in and they're like, "You guys are really mellow. Like this floating thing must really work." And of course we say, "Yeah, absolutely." And inwardly we're thinking, "We're just mellow people. Like this is how we were before we started floating too."
Yeah.
And so for us, I think it's much less even a stress reliever. Although when in moments of high stress, like again opening a new center, doing something like this book tour, I've been floating every single day at each float center along the way, and that's been tremendously useful.
Yeah.
But personally, I get a lot of physical benefits out of it. So some people, again, I'm really not that susceptible to visual and auditory hallucinations. So at most, I get like kind of swirling colors. That's after
me too.
hundreds of floats.
Yeah.
Two of my previous girlfriends getting into the tank have, they get in there and it's like 15 minutes in, just crazy visions. Flying through star fields, talking to like aliens, just insane visions.
That's one thing that's really cool is the diversity of like people, their personal experiences. Like I'm like you, I don't really get any hallucinations or anything. It's more, for me, it's like more just sensation, like the senses I feel in my body when I go in there. And then like, yes, and then the theta state obviously kind of kicking in, like you can kind of feel when you're dipping into that sort of mental zone, and it just, and that's where it goes to. But I don't get like that visual. But then some people do. Some people like, yeah, so I had this whole image come to me, and like I went home and I painted it. Like one of the guys that works here, he made this amazing painting of this bonobo that he had this vision come to him in the tank, and it's like, man. And he showed me the arm. I'm like, that's spectacular. That comes to you. You get to see that in the tank. I'm like, I just see blackness.
I know. I'm like black. Actually very jealous at different points.
Me too. It sounds so cool, but
and I try. It's gotten more powerful, and like you might find this with time, but like my visuals definitely have gotten a little bit stronger. But like it started, I just had nothing. You know what I mean? But yeah, for me, it's I more notice it when I'm not floating. Because I try to float at least once a week, if not 2 to 4 times a week. Like 2 to 4 is really my ideal.
Yeah.
And it's more like if I happen to go for 2 weeks without floating, which at this point is rare, but I just went for 3 weeks without floating recently. We were shut down for a month, and another float center in town, the float shop, had offered us free floats. But honestly, we were working 18-hour days on construction, getting our shop renovated, and like I just didn't even have time to go over and take advantage of it. And like, yeah, man, 3 weeks into it, it's just like I could feel my body. I was like a little more snappy towards my coworkers, which I'm a normally mellow person. We were all under a lot of stress, but I was just like, this kind of sucks. Like I'm a less ideal human now, and I hopped back in the tank pretty much immediately once I realized that. Cured it. I couldn't feel my lower back anymore. I was just really pleasant to be around. Yeah, it's more like it's such a subtle effect, and it's so much towards what you want to be anyway, and your human optimal levels. I think you can, once you start floating regularly, not even recognize a lot of the benefits you're getting. And then, you drop off your habit, and it's like, oh, that's right. Like, my entire physical body, like my mental body feels a little cloudier. Yeah, all of it just benefits so much.
Yeah, no, I mean, the physical is always there, but like it's amazing how much you just feel better when you come out. You just feel like that tension releases. It just happens. Everything just kind of releases. It goes away, and that really affects your psychology. Like how like you said, you get snippy or whatever, or just not just your overall mood isn't just there. But then when you come out, you're just like, it's really just that release, that and that breakup from like the routine or the whatever you're doing. It really, I don't know, it attacks it from multiple angles, the physical side and then the psychological side. And it's its own like very unique, legit therapy. And the nice thing is we have so much research to draw upon that was already done back from the initial wave of the float industry, that we have at our resources, that we can like take out and use as examples, and like, oh, they've already done this study or that study. Not that I don't want more studies to happen. I think that'd be super cool to start getting more float research going on, in general. But yeah, it's actually, are you aware of any? You kind of mentioned it before, of like the most up-to-date float research that's happening.
Yeah,
out in the world.
Yeah. So there's it's it kind of gets back to what floating benefits the most too. So there's not that much going on. There was a whiplash study that came out of Sweden. Sweden recently has been one of the hubs of research, which is great. And there was a great whiplash study that came out for floating, helping with whiplash. And then there was a case study that they released from that overall study very recently. So that's probably one of the more recent things that actually got published. There's also a large fibromyalgia research project going on, and that again gets into these benefits. One of the things, so like us, it's great. We get helped out. It helps with our day-to-day operations. But as you guys know, there are some people whose lives are just changed by being in the tank. People who have chronic addictions or chronic pain like fibromyalgia or rheumatoid arthritis. Even athletes who have suffered some kind of injury and can't go back to their sport.
Discs, that's I heard. I had a major disc herniation last October, and when I was actually physically able to walk again, because for the first 2 days I'm literally laid out on the floor. Like I couldn't even lie on a bed because the softness of the bed would just cause too much of an arch, and like it would just I couldn't even do it. But then I was finally able to get in the car and come here. And that was like the first thing I was able to do is go for a float. And it was actually when I was in there, it was really cool because I put my arms above my head, as I usually do, and it felt like the most gentle, magical traction of my spine. Because you have these like more, chiropractors, and there's other forms of like spinal tractions that you can do. This was like such a beautiful, like gentle traction, but I really felt like the water obviously is always level. But it felt like I was arced over like a really, really gradual curve. and it was just slowly pulling me apart. And it felt amazing because it was just everything. If you have any back issues, they're so debilitating, like, on a lot of different levels, and it's very humbling. And just getting that release that I had there was unbelievable. And and athletes, any type of injury and pain management, you're right, the physical release, because it's so gentle and it just holds every square millimeter of your surface area of your body. It contours to it perfectly because it's a liquid, it's a solution. You don't get the pressure points, you don't get any of that kind of stuff. So it just really molds to your body and takes its shape, and then the Epsom salts, the magnesium absorbed can help release muscle tension, and it just, I don't know, it's for that therapeutic aspect alone. It's amazing that it's not really more utilized than it is right now.
It's crazy too, like the spinal injuries, car injuries. Some of the most amazing stories we've had were, so we have a secret hidden menu item, kind of like an In-N-Out kind of thing. You guys probably don't know In-N-Out.
I've heard of burger, yeah.
That's good. So they have a whole secret menu. You can like drive through and order things that aren't on the menu, and they'll get like animal style. If you ever go to In-N-Out, you should order things animal style. But we have a 16 float a month membership that we don't tell people about. We just go up to 8. And there have been several people who get a 16 float month of membership, and so far the 2 that have stuck with it for the longest had the exact same thing going on. They'd both been in accidents. They both had actual, spine and muscular injuries because of that. They were both given painkillers and were on painkillers and needed to consistently treat their pain. And through that had become addicted to painkillers and needed them to get throughout their day, and were still feeling pain even years later. And so both of them started floating. Loved it, bumped up to 16 floats a month, so they're floating every other day.
Wow.
And through that, they got off of their full spectrum of painkillers. They weren't feeling pain on a regular basis. And they were able to get off of them not just because the float tanks were dealing with the pain, but because of that extra dopamine release that you get.
Sure.
And the ability to fulfill that need for the fix that you're getting, that dopamine rush from whatever addiction it is you have.
That's right.
And, they came out and that really literally changed their lives. Like, they were saying they're able to focus at work. Their entire life is like gaining this sort of coherence that it didn't have before. And same with fibromyalgia people. I mean, for them, it's even, they had this going on for 4 years. People with fibromyalgia sometimes, it's a lifelong thing. Like, I've had people get out of the tank and look me in the eyes and say that their time in there was their first time in their entire life that they have not felt pain. And they didn't even know what that was like. And like, they'll cry. Like, I've had people just get out of the tank, part of our fibromyalgia program, and just start crying on our couch because they've, for the first time, known what that's like.
That's amazing.
Have we had anyone come through like that?
We've had some fibromyalgia people, and I remember one guy. He was so really lethargic because I think his maybe it's partially meds, maybe not. I don't know what, but he's just always tired, and he just he said he had fibromyalgia, but I wonder if there's also like some sort of chronic fatigue syndrome or something going on there as well. But he came in, he was waiting for us, He was early, and he just goes and lies on like the reception bench that we have there, and just lies there. He's like, okay, just get me when it's time to float, basically. And he just looked like he was just, in a very just uncomfortable, kind of exhausted state. And he went and floated, and then when he came out, he just had this he had a smile. He was just smiling, and he just like, his eyes were kind of half open. He just smiling. He's just like, you could just see like 1,000 pounds of just whatever was just taken off his shoulders. He just smiled and is like, I feel great, and like and when going in there, he just looked awful, and it's amazing how that transformation kind of just happened within the 90 minutes that you're there, So actually 90 minutes versus 60 minutes versus 30 minutes. What are your thoughts on all that? I know Float On does 90-minute floats. Float House here, we also do 90-minute floats.
Do you guys offer 60 minutes at all? If people like requested it or anything?
People haven't really requested.
We'll get them out early if they want to. We generally recommend 90 minutes for everybody.
Cool. Yeah, same here. It's really funny too. Like, since we're the float experts, I think it's really easy. Like, I've talked to other centers too, and they're like, no, my customers would never go for 90 minutes. Like, it's all about 60 minutes. And I'm like, you just have to tell them that that's better for them, and they'll understand that you're the expert. Yeah. But no. So 90 minutes. Basically, even talking to researchers, like over in Sweden, I was asking Annette Kjellgren, who's one of the Swedish researchers about. She's one of the only ones I know who's done research on longer floats specifically. Yeah. And what she found is that the benefits really do compound. over time. You know, that being in the tank even 2.5 hours is better than 1.5. You know, and 3.5 is better than 2.5. And that our bodies do hit different stages of relaxation. We hit different stages of dopamine release, and that longer floats legitimately are better. So in my mind, not only is that a better thing to offer people and better for them, it's also better marketing. Like, given that word of mouth is one of the strongest things in float tanks. Because again, you're not going to hop in a float tank and then someone asks how you're doing later that day, not say that you hopped in a float tank. Like, that is your story of what you did.
Exactly.
And so yeah, you know, given that, I think that the more benefits you can push, you know, that someone floating for 90 minutes is more likely to talk about it and more likely to have better things to say than someone floating for 60 minutes. And just on the scientific level too, and this is old hat to you guys, but you know, our brain waves, I mean, for me, it took a lot longer. Like, normally we don't switch over to that theta state for maybe half an hour, 45 minutes in. Again, there are the exceptions, like my girlfriend who was 15 minutes in, like obviously very clearly just dropped into theta state immediately, even her first float. But yeah, usually 30 to 45 minutes, which means if you're talking about an hour, including showering time, you're like just getting into it when it's time to get out.
That's true.
And we prefer that kind of like half getting into it, half actual effect of it, and get people out. And then the one last thing I'll say about it too is that 90 minutes is also the length of our sleep cycles.
Yes.
And I think that that's very familiar to our bodies. And that naturally, you know, if I stay in for 2.5 hours, I'll usually drop into it and then come out of it and then kind of like drop deeper into it.
Yes.
But at an hour and a half, I find it's really common for our body. Like, almost everyone is just like, that's the perfect length of time it seems to be. And it's because we are so familiar with that exact length of cycle too.
Yeah, and that's, I think, something for people just getting into the float experience, a 90-minute float, you will have that kind of in and out sensation. Like, you kind of have your initial, like, whatever state you're in the beginning, but you kind of drop into it, and it is quite common to come back. And then a lot of people kind of get, when that happens, they get a little agitated. It's like, ooh, I should just, because they're very there now, they're in that space, and like, I should just come out of the tank, my float's over. But if you're able to just kind of stay in there and ride it out, you'll very often drop in deeper right after that. Like, you kind of, like, that initial one's just breaking, it's like the icebreakers, breaking up the ice, and then the boats behind it are just going to smooth sail. That's kind of what that first dip in is like, breaking the ice, and then you can kind of go deeper into it.
Was it Chris that does routinely he floats for 12 hours?
Yeah,
He does that once a month? Or he did that once a month?
Yeah. And I'm not sure if he's still doing that. He's been using his meta tanks a lot more. That's what he calls them.
The vertical tank. Okay.
Yeah. So like
cross-legged one.
Yeah, exactly. You sit. It's like a much narrower one. You sit cross-legged in it, and just sitting cross-legged, you're kind of elevated and like hovering above the floor, cross-legged, sitting in the tank. Yeah. So a little deeper water, but obviously much smaller. And so he's been using the meta tank a lot recently.
Cool.
Because it's small enough to keep in his apartment, and he had a full-on vertical float tank going too. But they ran into some zoning issues and stuff like that that caused some problems. So hopefully the next vertical tank within the next 6 months, a year, will be up and running, and we can play around with that again. Yeah, always experimenting.
That's what's cool. Like, yeah, Chris is definitely one of those guys who's not afraid to go out and try something new.
And since the audience doesn't know Christopher, I'll just introduce him slightly. Sure. Like one of my business partners, Christopher. Like, you just have to understand, talking about him, that he's more float tank than human being at this point almost. Like, he was doing sensory deprivation experiments on himself before he knew that sensory deprivation was a thing.
Wow.
Like, he was when he was 15, he was laying in bed, like with as equalized the temperature as he could get in his bedroom, and cotton balls in between his fingers, and just like laying in pitch blackness in his bed for like 24 hours and trying to get as close to nothing as he could get.
Wow.
And this is before he knew that float tanks existed, you know?
When he discovered float tanks, he must have been so happy. He
exactly.
Like, this is awesome.
He was stoked. I mean, when I met him, he was running floats out of his apartment, which is how I floated with him. And his bedroom was the float tank, and he slept on the ground next to the float tank. I was like, it is just, he's been building his own since the 90s. He's been floating himself since the 70s.
Yeah.
He's one of the longest term floaters that I personally know.
Cool. We get some of those old school floaters to come out of the woodworks every now and then. We have one of our handymen, Tim, who works around here. He's been floating, I'm not exactly sure how long, but
since the 80s.
Probably since the 80s at least.
Since the initial wave.
And it's interesting. They refer to it as zoning. I guess when they
really, I've never heard that before.
Tim always talks about he's like, I zoned really well today. He's
oh man,
zoning.
I have so never heard that.
And his whole thing is he'll go and he'll do his float, and afterwards he'll come up and be like, yeah, I zoned, and then he'll go get a beer, and he'll sit outside, have a beer, and relax.
Yeah, that's his
whole little ritual that he does.
That's awesome. I love it.
Stress buster routine. Like, over a course of 5 days, he'll float every other day. So he'll have 3 floats in 5 days, and he's like, after I do that, I have zero stress in my body. There's nothing left. I just bust it all out. Like, that's awesome, Tim. You know.
Yeah.
What's your longest float you've ever done?
It was accidental, and I've never really, I think, so I'm coming up on my 30th birthday here.
Cool.
And I think I may end up doing like a 24-hour float for that, just to kind of, ring it in a little bit.
Cool.
But certainly I'm actually going to try for duration. The last one, so I just don't time myself usually. I try to go in after hours or when there's a couple sessions back to back we don't have scheduled, so I can just float and get out when I feel like it. And sometimes it's after an hour. I think more often than not, my natural tendency is 2.5 to 3.5 hours is where I want to get out.
Yeah.
And then, one time I got out is around, I can't remember, 5.5 hours, I think, when I was in there.
Cool.
But that was actually one of the ones where I was like, I must have been really deep.
Right.
Because I felt like I had gone for an hour and a half, 2 hours. And so I was like, good 2-hour float, and get out and look at my clock, and I'm like, okay, good 5-hour float. But yeah, that's my personal longest, and again, just completely unintentional.
Yeah, I find, I try to go.
What about you guys? How long have you guys floated, like, the most?
Typically, I'll do a 90-minute session, but then every now and then, every couple of weeks, I'll do a good 3.5-hour session.
Yeah.
The longest one we ever did, and we kind of did it at the same time, was we did a 7-hour float. In fact, we were actually going down to True Rest in Arizona the next morning. We were doing our maintenance that night, so we stayed up till like 3 in the morning doing our maintenance, and we're like, well, let's not go home, let's go in the tank. So we went from like 3 to
about
10, something like that,
Yeah.
and we just stayed in the tank for like 7 hours, and it was great. That's when I had my first like real visual experience in the tank.
Nice.
And I'm not sure if I was dreaming. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but basically, I thought somebody had actually turned on a light inside the tank. It got really, really bright. I actually remember kind of like looking up and see the door was open, and it just got really, really bright, and I kind of woke up in this really bright light room, and I was there for like a minute just kind of floating in this light room, and all of a sudden snapped out of it, and then just back into blackness again. That's the only real visual thing I've ever really had. I've seen like a couple little things here and there, but...
Yeah, what's like the most intense experience you guys have had in the float tanks?
Oh.
Well,
I
guess we can kind of say this because we're pretty far in, and people might even get this far in.
That's
but,
true, yeah. We can go into deeper talk now.
Yeah, I've kind of experimented with
around.
psilocybin a little bit in going to float tanks, and some of those experiences have been pretty interesting. In fact, when I've come out of there, I did one float, and Greg was working, and I just came out of the tank, and I'm just like, everybody needs to try that. Everybody needs to try that at least once. And it was just, you just get really deep into yourself and like where you are with your life and what's happening, and you start going into just all sorts of different realms and thoughts about what the state of the world and what it needs and all sorts of different things like that. So
yeah, no, for me, when we first got our home tank, which was a Samadhi tank, the first 6 weeks that we had it, I pretty much floated every other day. I was floating every other day because it was in my condo, so it's just right there. And I remember I was going through this phase of it at one of those points where I was kind of hitting a plateau almost. So it's like not really much was happening. I didn't really know, because like the thing about floating too, you kind of have like, it's an ongoing journey. I mean, obviously there's no destination. There's no like I got to try to achieve this state or have this experience or that. There's nothing like that. It doesn't really. There's nothing. So I was in the shower, having my pre-float shower, and I just kind of like was putting out. I'm like, you know what? Show me something. Teach me something. Just whatever. I just kind of put it out there like that, and completely sober. And I went in, and I had just this. Like a lot of times, especially then, I was getting a lot of sensations where you either feel like you're dropping away or you're rising up. This one, it felt like my whole body was disappearing, and all of it, I couldn't feel any of it except for this little like point. It like condensed down to a single point right on my chest, right above my heart. And I felt like this little thread of like, it felt like a thread that's all I had left. If I was able to snip that thread and disconnect, I would have been gone. The rest of me was already gone. I was like, and my heart was pounding. It was super intense because I was really scared. I'm like, if I can release that last little bit more, I don't know what's going to happen. That's really what it felt like. And it was super humbling, super intense.
Did you get it? Did you release the last little bit?
No, I couldn't. I was too scared. I was way too scared. I don't know. I couldn't do it. So that was one of the most, like, especially after like I kind of put out that intention in the shower.
Yeah.
And I came out of that and I wrote a really good just personal journal entry at that time. And it was so humbling. It was super, super humbling. And, but then, I've done the psilocybin in the tank and things like that. And those are, they're really, really intense. You know, I wouldn't say to anybody that's listening to this to just jump in and do something like that.
No, not even like, you shouldn't even smoke or do anything before going in for like your first 3 or 4 times. Exactly. Like, and it's so rare we get a baseline, like trying to affect your like nothingness with something else to start out with is just totally not the way to go. But
you can, that's the thing, you can have like, especially once you get kind of into it, you can have crazy experiences completely sober. You know, like you just go in there, and it's about learning how to let go. And the more you can let go, you can go.
Those longer floats, like those 3-hour plus floats, I find the ones where you start experiencing things like that. And you're right, you don't need anything in there. You come out.
I like it better usually. You know?
I've done
having that clean, clear head going into it. And then especially having like 3.5-hour float, which I try to do like once per month. I try to do a 3.5-hour float once per month, and that's just you do something like that because I kind of prepare for it the whole day. I'll know I'm doing it, so I'll kind of make sure I'm timing my ingestion, mildly even dehydrating myself before that float because I don't want to come out, and just make sure you time everything up so that way I just stay in the full 3.5 hours. And basically, I don't move when I'm in there. I don't move. I just get that spot. And sometimes you get a little discomfort in your shoulders, whatever, but usually it's just a tension. So once you kind of release it, it kind of just goes away anyways. And then you just go and you come out of those, and like you said, like those effects, they get accumulated. And I come out of that, I feel like melted butter over a muffin or something. It's like,
it's fun. One of the pieces that our artwork, our artist tossed in is like, it's like a bread with like, just a person being spread as butter over the cup.
It's so true. So, I mean, you can have amazing experiences in there. And that's the really fun part of it, obviously. But, going back to the therapeutics, the stress management side is, for me, it's so good. Like, just being able to have that ultimate release, that disconnect is just, as long as I have access to a float tank, I will always float. And I hope it's always at Float House, but and I'm sure it will be. But it's its own beast. You can't match that with anything else. It's like the float tank is its own unique form of therapy.
And again, like I love it because it's the most non-interventionist that I've been able to get with anything that I do. Like what I love about the float tank, again, is it's not the tank. Like the tank is doing nothing but cutting things out. Like the amazing thing is that our body is what's doing that. Like those visions, that like therapy, like all of that is just how, like if our body were able to, we'd be walking around on a daily basis, healing that fast. We'd be feeling that way. We'd be in theta state. Like our body wants to take care of us, and unfortunately, there's some real world demands that.
That's the thing, and it gets, without. It's funny because especially in Western society, we're not taught any form of real kind of like progressive relaxation technique. It's not educated at all in terms of how to relax, how to take care of yourself in that regard, and it's always just about being productive. And if you're not doing something that's productive, then you're wasting time. That kind of connotation of like, if you're not doing something, you're doing nothing, like, and that's not good, or it's like not beneficial.
There's something wrong with that. Like,
we're all programmed to have that sort of thing. It's like, why can't we just stop? Why can't we just stop for a second and breathe and enjoy nature for a little bit, or and just enjoy your nature, ourselves as nature. You know what I mean? Like that's. You start to realize that kind of stuff when you get into the floating world, and you start thinking like, what are we doing? Yes, we're a very intelligent species. We produce a lot of interesting things, but we also cause a lot of harm. But why are we in this urgency? Why is there so much rush all the time? And that just creates so much stress, and ultimately it's really unhealthy, and you're not optimized. You're not at your utmost potential because of all the demands we have placed on us, And I love floating. I love floating.com. I'm taking that one.
I wonder if that one's taken.
I know.
Yeah, I race you for it.
You probably have it saved on your phone, like, I'm just going to go GoDaddy right now.
I do. I have a domain search thing saved on my phone. Yeah.
That's what you do when, when you're relaxing at the end of the day with a beer
What would be my favorite float tank related domain that I have right now? Actually, this is just we can stop this conversation too anytime. I'm sure that I probably need to go feed my meter again or something.
Yeah, no, we'll wrap it up.
We have tankpranks.com.
Nice.
Yeah, tank pranks.
Nice.
Because we really we never get it together because we're always so busy. But every April Fools, we want to do cause someone's in a room for 90 minutes, which means you have 90 minutes to readjust the outside of the room however you want. So tankpranks.com. If you guys ever think of good ones, we recorded one for Jake Marty where it was we turned on the music at the end, but it's just like two of our employees, Janine and Brian Gray at the time, just talking and being like, Jake, hello, he's not waking up. Like, Jake, and he preferably be alert at that time, and be like, yeah, what? But there's just these voices whispering he's not actually alert or coming to.
I'm really here.
Yeah, and they're like, should we call a doctor or something? And then my favorite one that I really wanted to do is just build a replica of one of our float tank rooms that we could wall up while someone's in the float tank, and so they open the door and walk out, and it's just they're in the float tank room, like a mirror image of it.
That's hilarious. Tankpranks.com. Right, that's coming down the pipe from Float On and Float Tank Solutions. Well, I don't know. You got anything else to say? Or we're gonna wrap it up?
No, I think I'm good.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank Omid. He's behind the scenes here, controlling the cameras. There he is. And thank you for helping us. He's the technician behind this initial podcast and the whole setup. So thank you, Omid. He has an amazing YouTube channel called Omega Point. If you're still out there listening to this, definitely check that out.
Have you ever think about calling it Omega Point? Yeah. Just wondering.
And then there's floathq.com is your website?
Yep, exactly. And more than that, if you're outside of Portland and interested in floating, floattanksolutions.com is definitely the one to visit just for much more of what we're up to in a broader sense.
And obviously we're here at Float House Broadcasting, and our website is floathouse.ca. Hold on, what do you got?
One more, which is I just realized if you want the book, the John Lilly book,
yes.
Other than Amazon, go to Coincidence Books. Coincidencebooks.com. And you can learn a lot more about it there. I just realized I forgot to send out the easiest link in the world for anyone that actually wants to read up on that one.
Well, we'll make sure that we post all this stuff up with the video, with the production. So with that being said, thank you for helping us with our first podcast. This is pretty cool.
Oh, man, thanks for having me on board. You guys know how much I like talking, especially about floating and John Lilly. So, it's my pleasure. Anytime. All
right, well, whenever you're up here, too, we'll have to do another one, and we'll just get more into it. So I appreciate your time, and that was fun. That was awesome. Cool. Nice job, bro.
First one in the books.
Bam. All right, thanks for, if you made it this far, wow, I commend you. That's awesome.
Thanks, guys.
And we'll see you next time. All right, ciao.